It's May in Ohio, which means the NFL schedule has been released and the MLB and MLS is in full swing. With all of this great action comes some of my thoughts about it. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown, a show about teams from the great state of Ohio. I'm Mahirson Hassan, and thanks for tuning in. We'll start off with our one quick hit. We'll have two quick hits today. Our first one regarding the Tennis Open in the Buckeye State. So let's get to it. The Western and Southern Open may move to Charlotte in the coming years. Now, the contract with Western and Southern, or rather with Cincinnati, will still keep this place here, the Open here in the Queen City. That is our Queen City, not Charlotte's Queen City, for 2023, 2024. But by that time, I think in 2024, 2025, I think they will still play the Open this year over here. But there is a possibility that by 2024, whenever that $400 million tennis complex is built in Charlotte, we could see that move from Cincinnati to North Carolina. And you think about it, they've got a lot of interesting plans as well. I mentioned the $400 million tennis complex, 50 acres of land as well, which is encapsulated by a stadium that is more than 12,000 seats. So a little bit bigger than what you see in Cincinnati. I think ours is about 10,500 or about 11,000, one of the two. But nonetheless, this is historic. If it were to happen, and it's mainly because this Open, it's moved from ownership to ownership. And Western and Southern's new owner wants to move this out of Cincinnati, but it's been in this area since 1899, and it's gone through a lot of changes. It started off as a grass tournament, spent a couple years on clay before moving to turf and where it is right now in Mason. Speaking of Mason, that area gets about $50 million every year from that tournament. So my thoughts are, here's the thing. If you know anything about Cincinnati and you know about Mason, they get a bunch of money. And it's not just from the tournament itself. They've got a great community center. They've got Kings Island and Soak City in their backyard. You think about it, actually, I know this perspective. I live in Liberty Township. Liberty Township is probably much bigger than the size of Mason. And yet, the city of Mason makes 5 times the amount of money than Liberty Township does. Why? Because of Kings Island and things like that. So it's a big revenue builder. And I think the other thing that this tournament provides is national recognition. Not only that, because this is one of the very few of these types of tournaments. Essentially, this is not a major tournament on the tennis cycle, but it's one down from it. If you think about it, it's like the AAA of tennis tournaments. And I think there are only 2 others in the United States that are like that: Indian Wells, which is out in California, and the Miami Open. And that's it. Only 3 in the United States, and of course you have, I think, 2 one in Toronto, one in Montreal, and again they split whoever goes where. Some years the men go to Toronto and the women go to Montreal, and then vice versa the next year. But nonetheless, back to Cincinnati, that would just be crushing, I think, especially for a city like Mason that has really been up and coming, one of the best cities in the US according to a lot of polls. It would just be heartbreaking if it were to happen. The other quick hit actually just came out this morning, and it was the Reds releasing their City Connect uniform. I like it overall. Just to preface it, you got a black background with red and white lettering that says Cincy. Overall, it's not too bad. It actually kind of goes a little cold. I know this from other cities that have the City Connect. You think of San Diego's that is a lot more bright in the picture, or you look at, say, Arizona's, where they decide to go to their Latin heritage, calling themselves the Serpientes, which is Spanish for snakes. Cincinnati is actually, it's interesting because I was originally thinking, yeah, it's all right. I mean, it's not that bright, it's not that flashy, but I think it does bring something a little bit low key to the city, and it almost represents like the underrated state of what Cincinnati is. I mean, Cincinnati, on a national standpoint, Cincinnati is an underrated city. And I've known that living in Phoenix for a year, where not too many people know what Cincinnati is and where, and some people don't even know where Cincinnati is, for all you know. But at the same time, that City Connect uniform was something special, and I'd love to see it. I think it premieres next weekend when the Reds host the Yankees. Don't quote me on it, but I think that's when it will happen. So, on to the schedule release. And again, there's a lot of interesting talks, a lot of interesting videos going around for both the Bengals and the Browns. I posted something on TikTok that was earlier in the week about just my initial thoughts on the schedule. We'll start off with the Bengals, or actually, before I get to that, the Bengals and the Browns will face each other on week one. I talked about this in the TikTok, and I'll say it again. Overall, not a bad decision overall, mainly because of one thing. You think about the Browns, they're coming in with a new system, mainly defensively with Jim Schwartz. They're going to have a pretty big test. I mean, the Bengals offense is something special, and we've seen that over the past few years. To test a new Jim Schwartz like defense against a team like the Bengals, who have started to become like year in, year out Super Bowl contenders, is something special. And if the Browns can pull out the victory, they surely will be celebrating. The Bengals, on the other side, have always struggled against the Browns, even in this Joe Burrow era. They've still lost to them at least once a year. So, with that said, you start off week one in Cleveland. It's a tough game. And knowing how the Bengals have played, where they start off the year okay, but they start to grow once the season comes to an end and going into the postseason, like we saw last year. If the Bengals still operate under that facility, or rather that philosophy this year, that game actually may be a godsend to them because it gets that one loss, a piggy loss, out of the way. It gets them out of the way earlier on, and you get a schedule where it's nice and complimenting once you go into the latter stages of it. Looking at the rest of the Bengals schedule, they have 4 primetime games this year. Week 3, hosting the Rams on Monday Night Football. Now, I should say this. There are 2 weeks that the NFL is doing 2 games on Monday night. One is on ABC at like 7:15. The other's on ESPN at 8:15. This is the one that will be at 8:15 on ESPN. Nonetheless, it's prime time. You got Monday Night Football in the building. And it's a rematch of the Super Bowl. So it would be pretty good. Week 9 versus the Bills will be on Sunday Night Football. Big game, and I think a lot of us expected this to happen, mainly because of the Damar Hamlin incident. For all you know, it could be a Damar Hamlin return game should he be healthy. It was, again, great recovery overall, and unfortunate events that happened. This, I think, would be, in my opinion, would be a way to make it full circle, if you will. Week 11, the Bengals go on the road to the Ravens Thursday Night Football. I honestly thought this would actually happen at Paycor. Now, we saw the Bengals take on the Ravens on Sunday Night Football last year, so I thought they would reverse it and give the Bengals home field advantage, but they decided to give it to the Ravens this year once again. And then week 13, the Bengals play the Jags on Monday Night Football. Again, that's also not a surprise as well. The Jags, a pretty solid team, especially knowing how they finished off the season, and they beat the Chargers as well, one of the best comebacks in playoff history. So credit to the Jags. They had a great year, and I think Trevor Lawrence has really shown that this team, especially the Jags, knowing that you have the Titans, are a little bit of a quarterback carousel at the time. Texans have CJ Stroud. He's getting his bearings used to. Indianapolis has Anthony Richardson. He's also getting his bearings used to in their respective cities. I think Trevor Lawrence actually kind of provides some stability in that spot, if you will. So it would be interesting to see the Jags on Monday Night Football representing the AFC South. I should also mention some other interesting speculations with the Bengals. Week 13 will be at the Steelers. That one will be a Saturday at 4:30, but it will be called by Sunday Night Football Squad, mainly because that Sunday is Christmas Eve, and NFL does not usually do a primetime game on Christmas Eve when it falls on a Sunday. So that's why Mike Tirico and crew will be in Pittsburgh on a Saturday at 4:30. There is a possibility that the Bengals could get another one of these that I like to call a standalone game. Not necessarily a primetime game, but it's the only game on, and it's on a major network. Or in general, it's on, and that's what matters. And that could happen week 15 versus the Vikings, as that was one of the 5 games selected that could be on a Saturday triple header that we saw last year. Again, I think it's an interesting take, and I actually like what the NFL did there because I feel like the Bengals will still be a playoff caliber team this year. I can't say the same about the Vikings. Yes, they traded Adam Thielen away and they got Jordan Addison, but at the same time, I just feel like there are other possibilities. Maybe the Bears' new offense starts to get together. Maybe the Lions. I mean, the Lions are really starting to pick up some traction on the national stage. So maybe they take the NFC North and really show out this year. It will be interesting to see where the Vikings fall in that because it depends on how they do to see whether or not that becomes a standalone game or not on Saturday. And honestly, that could actually help the Bengals a little bit in the sense that, yes, you do get a short week going into that Vikings game, but you do get a full week before that Pittsburgh game Saturday at 4:30 in week 16. Now, I did hear this as well, and this was speculated yesterday with NFL scheduler Mike North with a talk that he had with different reporters that the Bengals offer to host a game on Black Friday every year, similar to how the Lions and the Cowboys host a game every Thanksgiving. But the NFL actually rejected that and wanted to focus on New York because it's the number one retail city in America. And, it's Black Friday, interestingly enough. I don't know how many in person stores are open, but okay. And they were deciding between Eagles, Giants, and Dolphins, Jets. Decided choosing Dolphins, Jets, which is still going to be a really good game if Tua and Aaron can really show out. A lot of them were considering Steelers Bengals for this slot, and that will actually still happen that Thanksgiving weekend. So there's a chance that we could see a lot of Steelers fans in Paycor Stadium. So with that, we have the schedule out. Let's go through the schedule and let's see how I think the Bengals will do this year. And again, I'm not going to be the guy that says the Bengals are going 17-0 because in my opinion, I don't think so. And it starts off with that first game against Cleveland. It's going to be close, but I think the Browns still have the Bengals' tail. They start off the year 0-1. Beat the Ravens at home, though. That's going to be a close game. Beat the Ravens at home. Beat the Rams at home. Beat the Titans on the road. Beat the Cards on the road. Still, they're now 4-1, 5 weeks into the season. They beat the Seahawks at home, so that's 5-1. I think they lose on the road to the 49ers, though. So you're about 6 games into the season, 5-2. Bills at home will be an interesting game, but I think the Bengals will actually take that. So they start off the year 6-2, in my opinion, which is still pretty good. Beat the Texans, they're 7-2. Lose to the Ravens, so they're 7-3. I think the Bengals might drop one to the Steelers. So I think they go 7-4. Well, yeah, I think they go 7-4. So 7-4. Jags on the road will be an interesting game. And knowing how Jacksonville played in primetime later on last season, if Doug Peterson's side can do the same, that could be interesting. For what it is right now, I'd actually take the Jags to win that. That's, I think, might be the one upset. So the Jags win that. Bengals go 7-5, and in my schedule, well, actually, I'll be a little bit more lenient this time. So though I was originally going to have them 7-5 and on a 3-game losing streak, but I think they beat the Steelers at home. It's just on the road they have their struggles. So still not bad. 8-4. They go to 9-4, beating the Colts at home. 10-4, beating the Vikings at home. Then they pick up the loss to the Steelers, going 10-5. 10-6. The Chiefs game is going to be oh so close, but I think the Chiefs still, once again, I mean, you think about it, they were 3 in the hole against the Bengals going into the postseason. I still think Arrowhead is for the Chiefs, in my opinion. So 10-6, and then they beat the Browns. So, in my opinion, and this may be a little harsh, I have the Bengals going 11-6 on the year. Again, you guys may disagree with me. You guys may think that the Bengals are sweeping the Ravens or the Browns or the Steelers, one of the two. I think, in my opinion, those games in prime, especially I'm looking at the 49ers and the Chiefs games, those are going to be toss-ups either way, in my opinion. Those are going to be tough games overall down the stretch, and there's not much the Bengals can do about it. If you can get a victory, go ahead, because it would be awesome, but I would suggest don't go into that game expecting the Bengals to win. as of right now. Again, the 49ers game is midseason. The Chiefs game is at the end. We don't know where the season lies for any of those three teams. But for now, I just don't expect much out of them, at least in that spot. But 11-6, and in my opinion, the Bengals still take the AFC North. So we're on to the Browns. The Browns have two primetime games. Week 2 at the Steelers for Monday Night Football. Week 17 versus the Jets for Thursday Night Football. I talked about this on my TikTok, and I'd still agree. You know, the Steelers on the road was going to be something special overall. Again, this is the fourth time in 5 years the NFL has put that matchup in prime time. And again, it's a pretty simple AFC North battle. And the last time this happened on Monday Night Football, it was Ben Roethlisberger's final game. So again, some interesting memories for Steeler fans and NFL fans alike in that regards. The Jets game, it's a good game, and I actually thought the Jets game would be in prime time. But at the same time, I don't really feel that confident that both the Jets and the Browns will still be in playoff contention by then. You think about it, it's the second to last weekend of the season. So by then, you're starting to weed out the bad apples. You're starting to weed out teams that have their losses overall. You know, you think about the Browns last year. Didn't have that solid of a season, but they were still in contention until maybe week 15 or week 16. And then you started looking at those games like they were garbage games. Maybe the Jets game starts to become that. Maybe the Jets make the playoffs. Maybe the Browns make the playoffs. But from what it seems like right now, it just feels like that game's going to be a little bit more underwhelming than what people are seeing it right now. So let's take a look at the Browns schedule to start off the year. So I'll stay with my prediction with the Bengals. I think they beat the Bengals week 1. Steelers, they'll lose to on the road. Titans at home. That's going to be a close one. I actually think the Titans get that. So 1 and 2. It's actually an interesting stretch, too, now that I look about it. You have the Titans at home, Ravens at home, 49ers at home. And in my honest opinion, I think the Titans lose to the Browns, actually. So 2 and 1. But I think the Ravens and the Niners beat the Browns easily. So 5 games in, the Browns are 2 and 3. On the road, the Colts should be interesting, but I think Anthony Richardson and crew will know what they're doing. So they're 2 and 4. On the road, Seattle should be another interesting one, but they'll end up losing. However, I think they will beat the Cards at home. So Browns are 3 and 5 entering the midseason. Ravens on the road, I think they lose. Steelers at home, I actually think they get one against the Steelers. So they're 4 and 6. At Broncos, I think they beat the Broncos on the road. I'll give them that. 5 and 6. Lose to the Rams on the road. Jags at home, I think they'll also lose. So they're 5 and 8. Then they go on, in my opinion, they go on a little bit of a run overall where they beat the Bears at home. They'll beat the Texans on the road. Jets game should be interesting. I think, in my opinion, they might beat the Jets at home. Give some playoff hopes, keep some of their playoff hopes alive, but I think they lose to the Bengals in their final week. So, in my opinion, I have the Browns going 8 and 9. Again, from what we saw from Deshaun Watson last year, there was not much of a convincing effort that I can say, bam, Deshaun Watson's going to take the Browns back to the playoffs, because it just doesn't seem that way overall. Maybe Jim Schwartz's defense shows up, but again, everything right now seems rather inconclusive with this team, and there's not much you can do overall. Now let's talk about the Reds and the Guardians in Major League Baseball. And the Reds are starting to play a little bit better overall. Took their series against the Mets earlier this week, and they won 7-4 last night against the Marlins, courtesy of a Jake Fraley 3-run home run in the top of the 9th. And again, you think about the Reds acting clutch, Jake Fraley in general acting clutch pretty good down the stretch, and they have not been swept at home, which is something special. And in that regards, they've only been swept once, and that was against the Pirates. So, and again, you think about it, this is a team that's played the Rangers, top of the AL West, Tampa Bay Rays, the best team in MLB, and yet they're still getting some results. And I think if there's anything that the Mets series and I think the Marlins series could prove this weekend, especially if the Reds can win that, is how decent this pitching can be. I think solid throughout their bullpen. It was solid versus the Mets on Thursday, and they had a plethora of different guys. Herget was the one to close it out. Lucas Sims had a good stretch in that one. And it's not mainly the guys like Graham Ashcraft and Hunter Green who are really the guys that, have to be that. But again, and I talked about it earlier this year, that the fact that the Reds can over rely in that type of position. And again, I don't think we're seeing it at this point. What we're seeing right now is a really, really good team. Now the question is, as this as the schedule gets a little bit progressively harder, where do the Reds stand in that regards? Because you think about it, you have the Marlins on the road, but after the Marlins on the road, you got the Rockies on the road, and then you're back home to host the Yankees. Again, Yankees game or the Yankees series rather would actually be pretty interesting. Reds actually have some interesting players on the mound for that. Lodolo, Weaver, and Green. For this series, you've got Law, who was on the mound on a Thursday for a little while, and then you have Weaver for Sunday. No idea for a starting pitcher on Tuesday. You got Hunter Green on Monday, Graham Ashcraft on Wednesday. So I like this approach where maybe you get a guy like Weaver, maybe you get a guy like Law, and then of course Green and Ashcraft are kind of bookending it in that regards. Pretty good setup for the Reds, in my opinion. And more importantly, recently, they've been doing pretty well, especially in some of these close games. Again, walked it off in the Mets on Tuesday, and then Jake Fraley with a clutch home run last night. I mean, the only one that's pretty glaring, in my opinion, is just that 17-4 loss to the White Sox, which, in my opinion, just didn't need to happen that much overall. So now on to the Guardians. They're hosting the Angels this weekend. Lost the first one last night, 5-4. I did look at it. They are not playing Shohei. So Shohei will not be on the mound for the Angels. But that being said, it is interesting for the Guardians knowing how this homestand has gone for them. This is the last series in their 9 games at Progressive Field. Went 2-1 in the first series against the Twins. 1-2 against the Tigers, though. So it's kind of a toss-up. And I think more importantly, it depends on where the MLB standings are at this given moment, where the AL Central just does not look that sharp compared to what we're seeing with the AL East and the AL West. For example, think about this for perspective. The Minnesota Twins are first in the AL Central. They're 21-18. Everybody below them, so that's the Detroit Tigers, the Guardians, the Chicago White Sox, and the Kansas City Royals, are below 500. Yeah, it's that bad. Everybody's below 500. I talked about the Twins, who are 21-18. Everybody in the AL East, that includes the Yankees, who are in last place, up to the Rays, who are in first with 30-10, are above 21-18 when it comes to an overall record. Again, that's something that's mind-blowing. I mean, the fact that we could have 3 wild cards all from the AL East. I mean, I'm shaking my head at it, to be honest with you, but it's kind of crazy. That being said, it almost shows that 3-3 homestand, if you will, against the Twins and the Tigers, not too good. Does not look too good. And this series against the Angels, in my opinion, will provide the Guardians with some perspective on where they stand, because from what we see, like what we're seeing right now, it doesn't seem like this Cleveland team is going back to the playoffs, let alone winning the AL Central. I just don't see it. They don't have at least that mojo. And yes, they have the pitchers on that squad, but sometimes Clase screws up. That happened last night when he gave up a run, you know. And I think more importantly, contrary to what we're seeing with the Reds, the Guardians, I think, are losing that lack of support when it comes to guys outside of the usual, like Bieber, Quantrill, and those guys. You think about it, in that Detroit series, the only guy that picked up a win, Shane Bieber, was on the mound. Everywhere else was not there. And that's where I think this Guardians team needs, I think, a little bit of a balance. And it begs a question, I think, which can be asked for both the Reds and the Guardians. have they dug a hole earlier on? And is this hole too hard to get out of? Think of an example for the 2022 Reds. Now, that team, if you just look at the first 25 games, was historically bad. 3-22. And to be honest with you, the owners were acting like a bunch of idiots. I don't blame them. I mean, if the team was sending a message, so be it, because they did a good job sending it to both the fans and to the ownership. But you think about it with the Guardians, these next few games could provide a lot of perspective. Same happens with the Angels, but you look at it beyond their schedule. They got the White Sox on the road. They've got a lot of in-division games, I should mention. But after that, you got the Mets on the road. So a little bit going away from home and going away from the division, most likely. But I think the more I see it, yes, you have two games, or rather two series against the White Sox, one on the road and then one at home. There's a lot of these games that I'm scratching my head thinking, can the Guardians really show up? I mean, I'm looking at their schedule later on in the year. They've got the Cubs, they've got the Braves, they've got the Astros. There's a lot of interesting notions going on in that part of Ohio. And right now, it just seems a little bit mundane. And even with the Reds, too, yes, they're getting the wins, but at the same time, this is a team that's dug themselves so much in a hole that they're 17-21 right now. Sure, a sweep would help, but this team needs a little bit of hope on the road. And yes, 5-12 away from Great American Ballpark, they need some help. They need some help down the stretch. So it's time to walk back to the soccer pitch now and look at MLS, including FC Cincinnati and Columbus. And this is an interesting point in the season for both teams, as last week FC Cincinnati beat DC United 2-1 and then beat NYCFC 1-0 on Wednesday in the US Open Cup. They will not be playing this Saturday, though, because they have their bye week during that time. Actually, pretty beneficial for them knowing that every team, except for one, is facing in another team on Wednesday, and that next Saturday is the Hell is Real matchup. So pretty good for FC Cincinnati overall. Columbus, on the other side, did not play last week, beat Loudoun United 5-1 in the USL Championship, and then they got Orlando this Saturday, and then on Wednesday, they play the LA Galaxy, both of them at Lower.com Field. Both of those will be at 7:30 Eastern. Let's take a look at FC Cincinnati first. And for me, the biggest question that I had, especially earlier on, was when are we going to get the trio going? Yes, Brenner's going to be leaving for Udinese, but Brandon Vasquez and Lucho Acosta really needed to show up in this area. Just needed to show up in this offense, and they did. Lucho scored actually a great Olympico on Saturday from the corner flag. It's just amazing. I mean, the guy's not that like show-stopping. I mean, he's not a Carlos Vela or Denny Boanga, but at the same time, he just pulls a rabbit out of his hat. You think about it, like that one Hail Mary goal against Orlando City a few years ago when he was with DC United, where he rises up, his 5'3" self, mind you, rises up off a Wayne Rooney cross from about midfield to head it in and give DC United the win. And then sometimes he just hits really good free kicks for FC Cincinnati, this time from the corner flag. Not the first time an Olympico has happened with FC Cincinnati. Excuse me, as Harris Medunjanin did that in 2020 during the COVID year. Again, great win on Saturday. Great win overall for the Orange and Blue, mainly Alvaro Barreal, who the more and more I see him is starting to become the best wingback in MLS, especially on the attack. You know, so many times he's just barreling down that left-hand side, and he's getting into those games. He's getting into spaces, and he scored a goal. He took the chance against Tyler Miller and crew, and he scored. And FC Cincinnati was able to get the win. Ended up being the game-winning goal in that opinion as well. So you think about it, going into this next game against Montreal, if you know anything about these two history against each other, you know that they love to score goals. You think about it, last year they met up at TQL Stadium. Montreal won that game 4-3. They met up a couple years ago in Montreal. Montreal won that game 5-4. And again, it was two late goals as well to give them the equalizer and then the game winner. So the more you look at it, the more I look at that back line, and more importantly, I look at how they've done at home and especially later in games. Yes, they may be 2-0, but to quote one of my favorite broadcast partners, Gus Koff, 2-0 is sometimes the toughest lead to hold because you think you're in the clear, but you're not. And we saw that with FC Cincinnati when they were up 2-0 against Portland before the Portland Timbers got that consolation goal, put FC Cincinnati under a little bit of pressure. Nonetheless, they were able to hold out. Same thing with DC. The more I see it, and the more these 1-goal wins are starting to pile up with Cincinnati, the more I look at these games that are tending to be a little bit on the offensive side, and I'm thinking, can the defense handle it? And I think more importantly, can this defense handle CF Montreal? You know, they've won 5 consecutive, 2 in the Canadian Championship. One of those was actually earlier this week against Toronto FC on the road. And I think more importantly for FC Cincinnati, they're not going to have their friendly left wing back Alvaro Barreal out there. He was able to pick up a suspension for accumulation of yellow cards. So he will not be playing in that match, to my knowledge. So it's probably, maybe you have Alvis Powell, maybe you have Ray Gaddis, but even with those guys playing fullback, they're not Alvaro Barreal. Barreal is a left back, an attacking mid, and a left winger all in one package. And that's why he works so well in this FC Cincinnati offense. When you don't have him on the pitch, it's going to be interesting to see what can go on, especially knowing that Montreal themselves have an interesting right-hand man if he plays in Waterman. So it'll be interesting. And I think more importantly, for FC Cincinnati to get a win here, more importantly, this game is a building block. You get the win against Montreal, and that sets up a really interesting matchup against Columbus because, yes, the wins are starting to pile up, but they're going to drop soon. And you don't want them to drop on Montreal going into what may be the biggest game of the year against Columbus, a team that the Orange and Blue could definitely see down the road for all you know. So there's the Orange and Blue. Now let's head to the Black and Gold of Columbus. As I mentioned, no game last week, but 2 games before I talk to you guys next week. But let's take a look at their opponents overall. Orlando, much like Columbus, is 4-4-2 right now. And there are 4 teams at 14 points in the Eastern Conference. Columbus is leading that pack in, I think they are in a 6th seed right now, either 5th or 6th seed, one of the two. And Orlando's at the bottom with 9. Again, there's a lot of different factors, the main one being goal differential as to why that is occurring. But you look at Orlando, making a little connection to FC Cincinnati, the Orlando City ended up losing to Montreal 2-0 at Stade Saputo, but they did beat the Galaxy. So maybe an indication for Columbus to maybe, start off strong, and then you got a little bit of a calmer game against the Galaxy. Again, a historically good team, but over the past few years have lost their luster overall. So you think about it, and looking at that Orlando game, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the idea that both of these teams are from Florida, but Miami came in and beat a Columbus team 2-1. And if you watch that episode of the podcast, I think, we did have an episode that week. You heard me say that, Columbus could take care of easy business, but at the same time, Miami's offense showed up, and more importantly, Columbus's defense didn't. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Orlando because they've been an underrated and rather underwhelming team, especially on the offensive side. Their defense is great. I have nothing against their defense, and they held FC Cincinnati scoreless earlier this year. We're just saying something knowing how the Orange and Blue have played. But again, you look at some of their key pieces. Again, their striker position has been a little bit wonky overall, but you have a solid attacking mid in Marcelo Pereira for Orlando. And that's a team that, it seems like whenever those two face off, it's interesting. It's going to end out in a draw. Nobody's going to be truly happy at the end of the day. And it may be the case, I should also mention, it just came to me that this is a rematch of Decision Day weekend from last year. I bring that up because it was Orlando and Columbus that were fighting for that final spot. And the game was in Orlando, and it ended out in a draw. More importantly, Orlando was able to get that final spot over Columbus. And it almost was the culmination to what was a dramatic unraveling with Caleb Porter's side last year, which Wilfred Nancy definitely does not want to replicate. And again, I think there's going to be a lot of emotions for that Columbus side, especially after the idea that you win MLS Cup in 2020, then 2021's not so good, and then 2022, people are thinking you're going to be a playoff team, and then surprise, surprise, you have quite a big downfall that led to Caleb Porter being fired. So a little bit of emotions there for Columbus. LA Galaxy, this will be an interesting one. A matchup between two of the 10 original MLS teams. And I think much like Columbus a little bit earlier, and probably even like during their Save the Crew era, it's tough to tell where the Galaxy are at this point because it looks like this team just needs to look in the mirror right now. They just don't have anything functioning. They have the parts. Marky Delgado is a great midfielder. Chicharito and Dejan Jovovic, great strikers. And they have a great attack, but it's just not working. And that's something that front office and especially their head coach, Greg Vanney, needs to do. And especially since their GM literally said in a message to the fans, if we do not make the postseason, I'm out of here. That's an interesting ultimatum as well, especially for your GM to say that. But nonetheless, it just feels like the Galaxy are lost, especially when they go on the East Coast, from what I've seen. So maybe that ideal follows them. But at the same time, if we know anything about the LA Galaxy, they're like their rivalries. And before this game, they're playing San Jose in the Cali Classico on Sunday. A lot of tempers will be flying. And if LA can get a result there, it gives them some confidence, right? It gives them some confidence down the stretch where they can make a run. I look at Seattle back in 2016. They were towards the bottom of the Western Conference throughout that entire season. They get Nico Lodeiro in July, and then they just spring out of nowhere. They get the 4th seed in the Western Conference and then cap it off by winning MLS Cup. I think one of the best turnarounds ever in the middle of a season. So you never know what LA Galaxy can do. And I think more importantly, that what MLS is thinking, when is that spark going to come? Because some people thought it was going to be El Tráfico, but they ended up losing that game at home to LAFC. Maybe it's this other game. Maybe it's this other game. And, it's almost like a snowball effect where, yes, they're getting worse, but at the same time, fans are thinking, the shoe's going to drop and things are going to get better at some point in the season. So maybe it happens in Columbus and some midweek game in Ohio on Wednesday, or maybe it doesn't. Speaking of the game itself, it feels like Lucas Zelarayan is going to really show up in this week, whether that be against Orlando, whether that be against Galaxy. I've heard that don't quote me on this, but in the past few games, maybe like 5 or 6, Lucas Zelarayan has at least contributed to a goal. That is, he had either a goal or assist in every match that has been played. That's a pretty good sign for a Columbus side, and especially knowing how he's played overall. Again, there's better teams and I think better players out there that could get MVP. But I think when it comes to playing the most complete game, and I think a little more underrated than what MLS is giving, I think you have to give it to Lucas Zelarayan for the way he's been captaining that Columbus offense overall. And when you look at the Galaxy game, I think you could also make the case for Orlando. It just seems like it's one of those games where it's going to be tight. Could be like a 1-1 or a 2-2 draw. It would be something to see down the stretch on what Columbus can do and what should be a very interesting battle overall. So that's it for Buckeye Sports Breakdown for this week. Talked about MLS, talked about MLB, and of course, did a lot about the NFL schedule release. I'm Mahir Sinhasan. Once again, thanks for tuning in. Happy 513 Day for those of you in Cincinnati. Happy Mother's Day for those who either are a mother or know a mother out there. Again, aunts, grandmothers, anybody. Happy Mother's Day to you all. I'm Mahir Sinhasan. I'll see you next week. Stay safe, and as always, go Ohio.